Blog Talk Radio.
Good evening. Welcome to the View Up Here. And that sounds too low. Come on. You think I'd have this worked out by now, don't you? Whatever. Welcome to the View Up Here. January 23rd, 2019. God damn it. Oh, that was interesting. Thanks, Skype. The View Up Here Global. Davos, 2019 World Economic Forum. Out of control. Wow. Is getting pretty weird. The World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland is the largest annual gathering of the world power structure. Representation from over 100 governments, over 1,000 corporations, leaders of international agencies and NGOs, cultural leaders, and hand-picked rising stars of developing global trends. Global brand with huge opinion influence, media presence. Politics are always paramount presentation. But there is more than photo ops. TVUH has access to the best statistical datasets anywhere. Their annual pre-conference report contains far more information than corporate media will ever allude to, never mind reveal. Is the world sleepwalking into a crisis? Global risks are intensifying, but the collective will to tackle them appears to be lacking. Instead, divisions are hardening. The world's move into a new phase of strongly state-centered politics, whether domestically from political rivals or externally from multilateral or supranational organizations, resonates across many countries and many issues. The energy now expended on consolidating or recovering national control risks weakening collective responses to emerging global challenges. We are drifting deeper into global problems from which we will struggle to extricate ourselves. That's the first paragraph of the executive summary of the World Economic Forum report for this conference, titled 2019 Global Risks, Out of Control. Nearly 150 pages, it is a sobering, thorough, and refreshingly propaganda-free study. Clear how the magnitude of categorical risks has changed in the last 10 years. No matter what issue you look at, food, health, human rights, economics, governance, they all have one thing in common that plays into the picture: climate. 3 of the top 5 risks by likelihood and 4 of the top 5 by severity of impact are all climate-based. Now, I'm not going to cover every issue in this report, but I guarantee you're going to learn more tonight about what really goes on at Davos besides the photo ops from the brand representatives. You're not going to find this stuff out watching TV news. Of course, Davos is the official Bilderbergs, I guess you could call it. Been around for quite a while. It is by invitation only, but this is from their website, weforum.org. What makes our annual meeting unique? The World Economic Forum annual meeting is the only yearly gathering that brings together leaders of global society, the heads and members of more than 100 governments, top executives of the 1,000 foremost global companies, leaders of international organizations, and relevant non-governmental organizations, the most prominent cultural, societal, and thought leaders, and the disruptive voices of the forum's young global leaders, global shapers, and technology pioneers come together at the beginning of each year to define priorities and shape global industry and regional agendas. Participation is by invitation only and reserved for members of the forum's communities. The ongoing close collaboration with those communities, in cooperation with a network of global future councils, ensures the solution-oriented substance of the annual meeting. Numerous initiatives of global importance have been launched at Davos. The World Economic Forum is an independent and impartial international organization for public-private cooperation. Its objective is to improve the state of the world. It does not promote any political, commercial, or personal interests, nor does it use the names of its participants for promotional purposes. The annual meeting aims to be open and inclusive. Transparency and public inclusion are achieved through broad international media participation, televised sessions and webcasts, and through the forum's millions of followers on social media. The annual meeting achieves the greatest media impact compared to any annual event outside the world of sport. As I said, they wrote that. You know, the one thing I respect about the World Economic Forum is they actually do let a lot of things go, but they don't do it in everyday language. You have to be able to speak their language to understand what they're really saying. They're actually pawning themselves on a couple things. But they do have the ability to compile and put out very, very good reports that are indeed global in scale. There's not a whole lot of organizations that can pull that shit off. And this report is impressive. There's a huge amount of information in it. Like I said, you're never going to hear about it being Joe Blow and not looking into it. There's just no way. And it's important, seriously important. There are 3 or 4 pages at the beginning of the report that are graphic in nature. One of them is kind of a Maltego graph. They've got just amazing graphical representation of their findings. And I didn't even bother trying to put them on the slideshow because they're just too big. They're too high quality to reduce them to stick them on the show page. If you go and look at the report, you'll see. Just imagine what those 4 pages cost. Well, what exactly do they talk about in their reports? Well, in an appendix of the report, there is the descriptions of global risks and trends. Now, a global risk is defined as an uncertain event or condition that, if it occurs, can cause significant negative impact for several countries or industries within the next 10 years. So what do they identify as economic risks? Asset bubbles, deflation, failure of a major financial mechanism or institution, failure of critical infrastructure, fiscal crises in key economies, high structural unemployment or underemployment, illicit trade, including tax evasion, money laundering, human trafficking, and organized crime, severe energy price shock, increase or decrease, and unmanageable inflation. Well, there's cases of every one of them happening somewhere in the world right now. Environmentally, what are the risks? Extreme weather events, failure of climate change mitigation and adaptation, major biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse, either terrestrial or marine, major natural disasters, earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, geomagnetic storms, interesting they include that, and man-made environmental damage and disasters. oil spills, radioactive contamination, etc. What about geopolitical risks? Failure of national governance, failure of regional or global governance, interstate conflict, otherwise known as war, terrorist attacks, state collapse or crisis, and weapons of mass destruction. Again, all these risks aren't a stretch at all. Societal risks considered in the report: failure of urban planning, food crises, large-scale involuntary migration, profound social instability, rapid and massive spread of infectious diseases, water crises, and technological risks, adverse consequences of technological advances. That's loaded, isn't it? Breakdown of critical information infrastructure and networks, large-scale cyber attacks, and massive incident of data fraud or theft. So again, every category, every risk is present. There is a history of every one of those risks already. So, might make it a little tough to narrow it down. We better do a report. Okay. Now, what are the descriptions of global trends? What are the variables that are affecting things at this point in time? A trend is defined as a long-term pattern that is currently evolving and that could contribute to amplifying global risks and or altering the relationship between them. Aging population, changing landscape of international governance, changing climate, degrading environment, a growing middle class in emerging economies, increasing national sentiment. Isn't that a wonderful way to put nationalism? Increasing polarization of societies, rising chronic diseases, rising cyber dependency, rising geographic mobility, rising income and wealth disparity, and rising urbanization. Those are all things that this report recognizes as happening right now. There's a lot more to this than the photo ops. This is for all the policy wonks and quimbies that get off the plane after the limo drives away, and they're the people you never see. This is what they get to deal with. Now, looking at this annual report, there are a couple pictures in the slideshow that I've abbreviated. You know, like I said, everything is related to climate. Climate is the cornerstone to what's wrong with the world right now, according to the World Economic Forum. Now, how have things changed in just 10 years? Well, in 2009, the top 5 global risks in terms of likelihood, the top 5 things that were likely to happen that suck. In 2009, number 1 was asset price collapse, right at the crash. Slowing Chinese economy was number 2, risk to the entire world. Number 3 was chronic disease. Number 4, I can't read. And number 5 was retrenchments from globalization. So 10 years ago, the first hints of nationalism were happening. Number 4 was the global governance state. So nationalism started to show up, but it was still economy was the most important thing to the world. Go to 2014. Number 1, income disparity. Number 2, extreme weather events. Number 3, unemployment and underemployment. Number 4 was climate change. Number 5 was cyber attacks. That's a big change. And remember, not anything from 2009 went away. There's still the problems with, for some people, the Chinese economy slowing. There's still outbreaks of disease. There's still failed governance. There's still a step away from globalization. Those problems are all still here, but they were outshone by these. Then we go to this report, 2019. Number 1, risk globally in terms of likelihood. Like, this is probably going to happen. Number 1, extreme weather events. Number 2, failure of climate change mitigation and adaptation. Number 3, natural disasters. Number 4, data fraud or theft. Number 5, cyber attacks. So again, let's look at 2009. Has income disparity, or 2014, has income disparity been fixed? No, it's worse. Is unemployment and underemployment been addressed? No, not really. But they're not even in the top 5 anymore. That's how serious things have become. Now, the top 5 global risks in terms of impact, like what would hurt the world the most? In 2009, there was the asset price collapse, then the retrenchment from globalization, then the oil and gas price spike, then chronic disease, and then fiscal crises. The World Economic Forum decided that the 5 things that would hurt the world the most out of everything out there, 4 of them were related to economics in 2009. One was health. 2014, fiscal crises is now number 1. What's number 2? Climate change. Number 3, water crises. Number 4 is unemployment and underemployment. And the 5th one was critical information infrastructure breakdown. None of the things went away, but these are now the big problems. Go to 2019, the number 1 risk in terms of impact, considering what's happening in the world right now. Weapons of mass destruction. This is the World Economic Forum saying, yes, we believe that there could be a nuclear war with who's in charge in certain places right now. Has to be considered. And they put it at number 1. Number 2, failure of climate change mitigation and adaptation. Number 3, extreme weather events. Number 4, water crises. And number 5, natural disasters. Water crises is classified under a social risk, which it is. But what's its cause? It's environmental. So 4 out of the top 5 that the World Economic Forum considers to have the highest impact on the entire world, 4 out of the top 5 are related to climate. I'm going to read a little bit from the executive summary of the report. The first paragraph was in the opening. I'm just going to read the parts of the executive summary that I'm going to cover. There are more that I'm not going to breach. Just too much. Geopolitical and geoeconomic tensions are rising among the world's major powers. Those tensions represent the most urgent global risks at present. The world is evolving into a period of divergence following a period of globalization that profoundly altered the global political economy. Reconfiguring the relations of deeply integrated countries is fraught with potential risks, and trade and investment relations among many of the world's powers were difficult during 2018. Against this backdrop, it is likely to become more difficult to progress on other global challenges, from protecting the environment to responding to the ethical challenges of the 4th Industrial Revolution. Deepening fissures in the international system suggests that systemic risks may be building. If another global crisis were to hit, would the necessary levels of cooperation and support be forthcoming? Probably. But the tension between the globalization of the world economy and the growing nationalism of world politics is a deepening risk. Interesting. What are they really saying? Well, we created this global scam economy, and it works when everybody gets along. Now you want to start using us as enemies domestically and screwing some of the partners. This isn't going to work out well. So, gee, what country could they be talking about here? Maybe it's the country whose president decided not to go to Davos. What a shock. Environmental risks continue to dominate the results of our annual Global Risks Perception Survey. This year they account for 3 of the top 5 by likelihood and 4 by impact. Extreme weather was the risk of greatest concern, but our survey respondents are increasingly worried about environmental policy failure. Having fallen in the rankings after Paris, failure of climate change mitigation and adaptation jumped back to number 2 in terms of impact this year. The results of climate inaction are becoming increasingly clear. The accelerating pace of biodiversity loss is a particular concern. Species abundance is down by 60% since 1970. In the human food chain, biodiversity loss is affecting health and socioeconomic development, with implications for well-being, productivity, and even regional security. Again, climate. Technology continues to play a profound role in shaping the global risks landscape. Concerns about data fraud and cyber attacks were prominent again in the survey, which also highlighted a number of other technological vulnerabilities. Around 2/3 of respondents expect the risks associated with fake news and identity theft to increase in 2019, while 3/5 said the same about loss of privacy to companies and governments. There were further massive data breaches in 2018. New hardware weaknesses were revealed, and research pointed to the potential uses of artificial intelligence, AI, to engineer more potent cyber attacks. Last year also provided further evidence that cyber attacks pose risks to critical infrastructure, prompting countries to strengthen their screening of cross-border partnerships on national security grounds. A couple of things said differently in that part, again related to the common excuse of national security. The importance of the various structural changes that are underway should not distract us from the human side of global risks. For many people, this is an increasingly anxious, unhappy, and lonely world. Worldwide, mental health problems now affect an estimated 700 million people. Complex transformations, societal, technological, and work-related, are having a profound impact on people's lived experiences. A common theme is psychological stress related to a feeling of lack of control in the face of uncertainty. These issues deserve more attention. Declining psychological and emotional well-being is a risk in itself, and one that also affects the wider global risks landscape, notably via impacts on social cohesion and politics. I'm not going to wager that any news network in English anywhere will say anything about that number, 700 million people. Rapidly growing cities and ongoing effects of climate change are making more people vulnerable to rising sea levels. 2/3 of the global population is expected to live in cities by 2050, and already an estimated 800 million people live in more than 570 coastal cities, vulnerable to a sea level rise of 0.5 meter by 2050. In a vicious circle, urbanization not only concentrates people and property in areas of potential damage and disruption, it also exacerbates those risks. For example, by destroying natural sources of resilience, such as coastal mangroves, and increasing the strain on groundwater reserves. Intensifying impacts will render an increasing amount of land uninhabitable. There are 3 main strategies for adapting to rising sea levels. 1. Engineering projects to keep water out. 2. Nature-based defenses. And 3. People-based strategies, such as moving households and businesses to safer ground or investing in social capital to make flood risk communities more resilient. So those are the things that I'm going to cover. As I said, if you like reading a report, if you want to get the full picture, you get to the end and there's not something you can't find an answer for on the subject, this is one of those reports. Everything's here. Power and values. Evolving risks in a multi-conceptual world. No room for nostalgia. It should be no surprise that a multipolar world is also more multi-conceptual. As global power is diffused, there is more room for divergent values to shape geopolitics than there has been since the end of World War II. After the bipolar Cold War game gave way to unipolar U.S. power, some argued that the battle of ideas was over and Western liberal democratic norms would, in time, prevail globally. That was a bold claim then, and it looks like hubris now. In today's world, narratives of gradual convergence on any set of overarching values look unconvincing. Values seem to be a source of division rather than unity, not just globally, but also within regions and countries. Nostalgia is an inadequate response, especially as previous decades were hardly risk-free. The imperative now is to understand the changes that are happening and learn how to safely navigate the challenges they entail. After a period of globalization that has deeply integrated many countries, reconfiguring relationships is unlikely to be easy. Don't you love how they use the word nostalgia to basically say, get your head out of your ass, you can't go back in time? States, individuals, and markets. Values-based tensions are manifesting in different ways in different places, creating new fault lines within and between countries and regions. But they have common features: control and the role of the state. Many political leaders and communities feel they have lost control, whether to internal divisions, external rivals, or multilateral organizations. And in response, they look to strengthen the state because notions of power, security, and self-determination are so politically fundamental. Clashes may have less scope for compromise than when differences involve more technical issues. You know what that translates to me? Facts, not fields. Please. Domestically, key tensions include the following: states and individuals. The The balance is tilted from individuals towards states. In this context, the idea of illiberal democracy has gained currency. States and minorities. Politically, rising majoritarianism means voting is increasingly a winner-takes-all contest between polarized groupings. Culturally, identity politics has become increasingly contentious, with national majorities in many countries seeking greater assimilation or exclusion of minorities. States and markets. Scale and power of multinational businesses has fueled growing opposition to globalization in many countries. Elsewhere, states are taking a stronger economic role. Almost a quarter of the world's largest firms are now state-controlled, the highest level in decades. The role of technology. New technological capabilities have amplified existing tensions over values. For example, by weakening individual privacy or deepening polarization, while differences in values are shaping the pace and direction of technological advances in different countries. Globally, key pressures relate to how states interact and tackle cross-border challenges. Multilateral rules and institutions that would have a common set of rules are being dismantled. Sovereignty and non-interference. The protections for state sovereignty in the UN Charter appear more resilient than the interventionist norms. In the digital era, efforts to promote or disrupt political values in other countries has become increasingly contentious. That's an interesting way to put it. Migration and asylum. The international involvement of people and the international movement of people has emerged in recent years as a fault line issue in many countries. Demographic trends will drive interregional migration in the decades ahead. Protection of the global commons. Climate change, outer space, cyberspace, and the polar regions are aspects of the global commons that are already or could increasingly become a source of international tensions. Was something that popped up in so many of those issues that they see as a problem. Climate. It's all related to climate. Shared goals amid divergent values. In a world of disparate powers and divergent values, it is likely to be more difficult to make progress on shared global goals. Such progress requires two things: aligning on substantive priorities for action, and then sustaining coordination and collaboration. The example of climate change shows that even when the first is possible, the second can be challenging. Broad consensus was built up over decades, culminating in the signing of the Paris Agreement in 2015. But evidence on implementation is mixed, and even full implementation will not be enough to prevent damaging levels of global warming. Challenges related to the fourth industrial revolution will evolve rapidly, and coordinating a response may be complicated when they touch on fundamental values. So what does that say? Shit's going to hit the fan, nobody's going to be ready, and there ain't going to be enough people around to contribute enough to do anything about it. So from what I've mentioned so far, and we're just basically starting, this is more about power and the conflict with values. Seems ridiculous, but there it is. Wait till we get further on. How much of this stuff are you going to see on network? Migration and cross-border tax policy are among other global issues that are both ethically charged and subject to divergent state interests. However, the most acute challenge may be posed by human rights, which have become a litmus test to the changing role of values in the international system. As geopolitical tensions and competition have intensified, human rights have been increasingly politicized. The complex global picture that is emerging in that area, nominal alignment on shared values, marked differences in interpretation and implementation, fragmented approaches to multilateral institutions, is a microcosm of the wider role of values in the international system. Values divergence is something they're using that is basically saying, how come the same words mean something totally different in your country than they do in my country? It's happening more and more. Multilateralism under threat. Political leaders have increasingly asserted the primacy of the nation-state in the international system and sought to weaken the constraints placed on national autonomy by international agreements and multilateral institutions. Defenders of multilateralism point out that this fragmentation risks creating blind spots, undermining global stability, and limiting the capacity to respond to cross-border challenges. The current multilateral architecture has been criticized in rising and legacy powers alike. In some rising powers, critics argue that the international architecture is too firmly shaped by the post-World War II balance of power and values and has failed to evolve. In economic terms, for example, in 1950, the United States had 27.2% of global GDP, and China had 4.6%. In 2017, those figures were the U.S. 15.3% and China 18.2%. Such shifts in the economic center of gravity create demands for institutional change. Meanwhile, in some legacy powers, critics argue that multilateralism is a costly drag on their freedom to maneuver. That's a nice way to put that. Well, no, we don't care if we earned this power or not. We've got it. Well, they're not taking it away. Fuck that. Multilateralism can be weakened in numerous ways. States can withdraw from agreements and institutions. They can intervene to block consensus, and they can adopt a selective approach to upholding norms and rules. Multilateral institutions can also experience a gradual process of disuse or disregard. Arguably, the cohesiveness of the multilateral system could be weakened by the creation of new parallel structures. But it is also possible that increased institutional density could bolster the resilience of the system. What's that translate to? Well, the first part, about withdrawing and intervening and be selective, that sounds like the UN to me. A parallel new power structure, that sounds like BRICS. International dispute resolution is an area of particular concern, so far manifesting especially in relation to trade. For example, if the appointment of new judges to the World Trade Organization's appellate body continues to be blocked, a key dispute settlement panel could cease to function in December 2019, when there will no longer be enough judges on the panel to issue valid rulings. Dispute resolution is a critical part of the architecture of international commerce, and the system is already changing. Its center of gravity is shifting from the West to Asia. How come you don't hear this on the U.S. networks where it's all America? Worsening trade relations. Trade is the arena in which the broader implications of a more multipolar, multi-conceptual world have so far played out most clearly. Trade relations between China and the United States rapidly worsened during 2018. There were positive signs in the final months of the year, raising hopes that a normalization of relations would follow, but the pace of the earlier deterioration highlights how quickly risks can crystallize and intensify in this area. In early 2018, on the recommendation of the U.S. International Trade Commission, President Trump announced global safeguard tariffs. The first time that provision had been used since 2001, totaling $8.5 billion U.S. on solar panel imports and $1.8 billion on washing machine imports. The U.S. later cited national security when imposing tariffs on steel and aluminum imports. And on 3 occasions, it increased China-specific tariffs related to intellectual property and technology disputes. These U.S. steps drew countermeasures from China, and the standoff soon threatened to cover all goods trade between the two countries. So what the World Economic Forum is saying here is, look, you clowns are the 2 biggest economies on the face of the earth now. Why are you fighting with each other? You're just going to fuck everybody else long term. Better yet, why don't you find something real to fight about in the first place? Oh yeah, Trump, sorry. So this is important. This is what they're actually talking about. This is what a lot of people think. This is what a lot of people sense. This is what some people know, but this is what you will never hear on the news. But it's in the Global Risk Report at the WEF. Economic policy, long seen as a means of mitigating geopolitical risk by embedding powers in mutually beneficial relationships, is now frequently seen as a tool of strategic competition. For example, the U.S. Department of Commerce's strategic plan for 2018 to 22 states that economic security is national security. Each side in the worsening standoff between the U.S. and China last year blamed the other for eroding bilateral relations, and domestic political factors have not always been conducive to compromise between the two countries. The current relationship is such that a rapid unwinding of protectionist measures cannot be ruled out, but some analysts have warned about more fundamental challenges. So what they're saying there is, even when it makes sense to roll stuff back, in the U.S. domestic political sphere, it's not about doing the right thing. It's about owning them. The World Economic Forum is saying, even if there is a solution, if it doesn't work out for the narrative, forget it. It's not going to happen. Almost all of the high-profile trade disruptions that were threatened or imposed in 2018 relate to exports and imports of physical goods. But a growing proportion of global trade consists of services, digital services in particular. As digital flows have increased in economic importance, so too have data localization provisions that require businesses to store data in the country where they are collected, rather than on company servers located elsewhere. Localization rules have been justified on numerous grounds, from privacy and intellectual property to national security, policing, and tax. Critics argue, however, that governments' expressed reasons for restricting data flows are often a pretext for what amounts to protectionism designed to inhibit cross-border digital trade. To say that's developing, in my opinion, is a severe understatement. Investment tensions. The past year's developments in foreign direct investment are arguably even more significant than trade tension. As discussed in last year's report, outward investment has become more associated with geopolitical positioning. As a result, caution towards inward investment is growing because foreign direct investment creates economic facts on the ground in a way that trade flows do not. This is an area where increasing geoeconomic competition could sow seeds of tensions that take years to grow and years more to resolve. Western countries in particular have been sharpening their power to block investments in strategic sectors, particularly emerging technology, raising the prospect of a partial unwinding of globalization in investment as in trade. In August 2018, the German government announced a reduction in the threshold at which foreign investments can be blocked. It had earlier instructed a state-owned bank to acquire a 20% stake in an energy infrastructure company to prevent its acquisition. This is not the first time that a European government has sought to restrict inward investment. In 2005, France notoriously fended off PepsiCo's mooted acquisition of dairy producer Danone. Then Prime Minister Dominique de Villepin lauded economic patriotism as the foundation of global competitiveness. That language prompted a backlash at the time, but it resonates today. In December 2017, the European Commission proposed EU-wide measures to control non-EU investment into EU companies. As only 12 of the 28 member states have screening mechanisms, one reason for EU concern is that many decisions need member state unanimity, creating vulnerability to foreign leverage in individual member states. In September 2018, European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker called for more foreign policy decisions in the European Union to be made by qualified majority voting instead. The U.S. also introduced legislation in 2018 to improve the screening of investment into 27 sectors, including semiconductors and telecommunications. In 2017, India tightened the rules for foreign businesses operating in power transmission. So you see what they mentioned about China and the size of their economy and how they're still leading the world in growth and everything else. China is traveling in the other direction, although from a very different starting point. According to Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, according to their data, China has significantly reduced its restrictiveness to foreign direct investment in recent years. But nevertheless, it remains among the world's most restrictive countries. While in 2018, China announced further cuts to its negative list, sectors into which foreign businesses are prohibited from investing, or which they can operate only as a part of a joint venture. Many sectors that would generate interest from foreign investors remain on the negative list. As a trade, if the climate for cross-border investment flows continues to worsen, it will hamper global economic growth and risk creating a vicious circle in which economic and geopolitical tensions aggravate each other. If this were to be sustained, it would leave many states, particularly smaller or weaker ones, having to make painful choices between securing investment for growth and maintaining fiscal control and strategic independence. No other country will be able to react in that manner. But that's a look at the section that's pretty much on economics. Heads and hearts, the human side of global risks. The Global Risk Report tends to deal with structural issues. systems under stress, institutions that no longer match the challenges facing the world, adverse impacts of policies and practices. All these issues entail widespread human costs in terms of psychological and emotional strain. This is usually left implicit, but it deserves more attention, and not only because declining physiological and emotional well-being is a risk in itself, it also affects the wider global risk landscape, notably via impacts on social cohesion and politics. The age of anger. Every year, Gallup takes a large-scale snapshot of the world's emotional state. It asked respondents, 154,000 across more than 145 countries in 2017, whether they had various positive and negative experiences on the preceding day. Overall, the positive experiences, such as smiling, learning, respect, those positive experiences comfortably outstrip the negative, which include pain, worry, sadness, but the trend lines are worrying. Although still the least prevalent of Gallup's negative experiences, anger is commonly referenced as the defining emotion of the zeitgeist. Some suggest this is an age of anger, noting a tremendous increase in mutual hatred. And while it is conceivable that public anger can be a unifying and catalyzing force, a hope often expressed at the start of the decade in relation to the Arab Spring, it has since come to be seen more as politically divisive and societally corrosive. In the United States, public opinion researchers note that where opposing political groups previously expressed frustration with each other, they now express fear and anger. In one survey, almost a third of respondents reported having stopped talking to a family member or friend over the 2016 presidential election. In another, 68% of Americans said they were angry at least once a day. Women reported themselves more angry than men, as did the middle class relative to their richer and poor. Anger's long been associated with the loss of status. Recent research also suggests a strong link with group identity. The risk is that this combination generates angry polarization, an increasingly prevalent feature of politics in many countries. In recent years, group identities have been hardened by a process of social sorting. Global trends in mental health. That negative experiences are on the rise chimes with what the World Health Organization data suggesting that depression and anxiety disorders increased by 54% and 42% respectively between 1990 and 2013. They rank second and seventh, respectively, in the global burden of disease. 5 of the top 20 are mental illnesses. Worldwide, 700 million people are estimated to have a mental disorder. Not all data confirm the finding that the prevalence of mental health problems is rising, but there are indications that the current generation of young people in particular are experiencing significant increases. In the United States, for example, the proportion of the total population with depression increased from 6.6% in 2005 to 7.3% in 2015. But the rise was much sharper for individuals aged between 12 and 17, where prevalence increased from 5.7 to 12.7. One study found that between 5 and 8 times as many U.S. students in 2007 reported psychopathological symptoms on a standardized survey than their counterparts in 1938. These trends are particularly pronounced for American girls. In 2016, 1 in 5 had experienced a major depressive episode in the previous year. Concerns have been raised about a loosening of diagnostic criteria, but behavioral evidence points in the same direction. The rate of self-harm for girls aged between 10 and 14 nearly tripled between 2009 and 2015. And the suicide rate for 15 to 19-year-olds increased by 59% over the same period. Recorded rates of mental health disorders are higher in the West. The lifetime prevalence rate for anxiety ranges from 4.8% in China to 31% in the United States. Suggested explanations for this have included reporting bias, methodological factors, and the possibility that in poorer circumstances, mental suffering is more likely to be seen as an expected part of life than a diagnosable condition. Nonetheless, people with mental health conditions in lower income countries can face profound difficulties. One study across 28 countries found treatment gaps of up to 85%. Within affluent countries, wealth affects well-being in complex ways. The prevalence of anxiety disorders is higher among lower-income groups, but attitudes towards money matter too. Researchers have linked reduced well-being to societal shifts away from intrinsic motivation related to community feeling and affiliation and towards extrinsic motivations related to financial success and social status. This is generationally significant. In one U.S. study, 81% of 18 to 25-year-olds said that getting rich was their generation's top or second goal, compared with 62% of 26 to 39-year-olds. Another important generational pattern relates to expectations of increasing quality of life, which the numbers say is probably not going to happen. There is a figure in the report. It's one of the slides on the slideshow. It's about life prospects. Question is, will you have had a better or worse life than your parents' generation? In China, I believe over 80% of respondents said yes. Less than 10% said no. In India, the yes was about 65. In Brazil, the yes was about 70. In South Africa, the yes was about 62. Those are the top four, all BRICS countries, all very young countries. Germany was the first Western country next, then the average. The average was around 55%, average globally, thought they would have a better life. Down to Japan, only 27% said they thought they'd have a better life than their parents. 40% said they would not. South Korea was about 35 yes, 40 no. France was 20% said better, 60% said worse. The U.S. was below average. Things are changing. It is generational. More human risks, violence, poverty, and loneliness. What is contributing to these patterns of increased negative experience? Violent conflict remains one of the most potent causes of emotional and psychological distress. There is a danger of complacency here because conflict-related deaths have fallen sharply since the middle of the 20th century. However, the overall number of conflicts is close to the highs of the early 1990s and has risen in recent years. While not mass death conflicts, these are clearly a source of emotional and psychological distress for huge numbers of people, particularly in Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia. The same is true for violence of other sorts. The prevalence of homicide is particularly important because it influences overall perceptions of security. Although the global rate fell for a decade before a marginal uptick in 2016, regions are affected very differently. Latin America accounts for 8% of the world's population, but 33% of the world's murders. Similar trend lines are not available for intimate partner violence, but the World Health Organization estimates that around 30% of women globally experience it during their lives and that it doubles the risk of depression. In 2017, 137 women were killed every day by intimate partners or family members. Do you remember seeing that on the news? Yeah, me neither. The proportion of the world's population living in poverty has dropped significantly in recent decades, alleviating one of the key threats to physical and mental well-being. But increases in the global population mean the absolute numbers are still extremely high. In 2015, there were 736 million people living on less than $1.90 US a day. And numbers were increasing in sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and North Africa, and even in high-income countries. Income and wealth disparities, ranked fourth as a driver of global risks, have been linked to increasing mental health problems. A third societal stressor is loneliness. This is on the rise, in the West in particular, where household structures have been undergoing a profound shift. Researchers call the current share of people living alone wholly unprecedented historically. In the United Kingdom, the average proportion of single-person households has increased from around 5% in pre-industrial communities to 17% by the 1960s and 31% in 2011. Similar figures are recorded in Germany, Japan, the Netherlands, and the United States. Many capital cities have even higher proportions of so-called solitaires. For example, 50% in Paris and 60% in Stockholm. In Midtown Manhattan, 94% of households are single person. Researchers argue that urbanization can weaken family or other bonds relative to smaller rural communities. This may help to explain high-income countries' apparently higher prevalence of mental health problems. Evidence of psychological strains related to urbanization also comes from emerging economies. In China, where the rural population plunged from 80.6 to 45.2% between 1980 and 2014, research finds increased levels of loneliness, both among migrants moving to cities and in the rural communities they have left. The latest official data in the United Kingdom point to an increase to 22% in 2017 in the proportion of people feeling lonely either sometimes, often, or always, up from an average of 17% in 2014 to 16. The proportion of people never feeling lonely decreased from 33% to 23% over the same period. A U.S. study looked at how many close friends people have. The average fell from 2.9 in 1985 to 2.1 in 2004, and the proportion of people responding that they had no close friends tripled over that period to become the modal response. The World Economic Forum knows what's happening out there, which means all those brand reps that attend have access to it too. Any of them going to do anything about this stuff? Technology, addiction, and empathy. In one recent study, technology was cited as a major cause of loneliness and social isolation by 58% of survey respondents in the U.S., 50% in the United Kingdom. However, the same survey found that social media was viewed as making it easier for people to connect with others in a meaningful way, and respondents who reported feeling lonely were no more likely than others to use social media. These findings exemplify the uncertainty around how technological changes impact individual well-being. Technological change is always a source of stress, but the current wave of change, the fourth industrial revolution, is defined by the blurring of the line between the human and the technological. Debate, for example, surrounds the claimed addictiveness of digital technologies. UK research in mid-2018 found that people spend an average of 24 hours per week online, more than twice as much as in 2011. At least one prominent endocrinologist has likened digital technologies to addictive substances in that they stimulate dopamine, which produces pleasure, but also require increasing use to get the same effect. Many business remodels rely on the efficiency with which new technologies can attract and retain users' attention. Some companies have even marketed their ability to leverage the behavioral impact of dopamine. That's a nice way to describe it. Multinational ad companies. Cool. However, others argue that claims of addictiveness are alarmist or overblown. The UK research found people still spend less time online than they do watching TV. Well, thank God for that. Another potential concern is that technology is leading to a decline in empathy, the ability to put oneself in the shoes of another. One study of students in the United States found that levels of empathy had fallen by 48% between 1979 and 2009. However, possible explanations for this other than the greater use of personal technologies include increasing materialism and changes in parenting practices. Debate often centers on how digital echo chambers can weaken cross-society empathy by anchoring individuals in tight-knit subgroups. The relationship between technology and empathy seems to be nuanced. Online connections can be empathetic, but research suggests the effect is 6 times weaker than for real-world interactions. That's interesting. That's very interesting that empathy has such a disconnect between digital and meat space. Somehow I don't think hate has a 6-to-1 ratio. Automation, monitoring, and workplace stress. Technological and societal change is linked to rapid transformations in the workplace. And what happens at work has the potential to affect emotional and psychological well-being. According to a survey of full-time employees in 155 countries, just 15% feel highly involved in and enthusiastic about their work. This engagement rate varies from 33% in the United States to just 6% across East Asia, a result the researchers attribute to overwork. Globally, a higher proportion of employees, 18%, were found to be actively disengaged, defined as resentful and acting out their unhappiness. For many workers, a pronounced recent change has been a blurring of the line dividing work from the rest of life. Work-related emails often begin long before the start of nominal working hours and finish long afterwards. Many families juggle multiple jobs with childcare, stressful commuting logistics, and caring for elderly parents. In growing numbers, employees cite the ability to manage work-life balance as the most important thing for thriving at work. According to one study, 50% of American workers say they are often or always exhausted due to work, up by almost a third in 20 years. In another study, when UK workers were asked to identify the main workplace causes of stress, half cited unrealistic time pressure and demands. The same study noted employees' concern about lack of consultation on workplace changes and lack of control over the work they do. Automation has long been a source of disruption in the workplace. It has allowed huge numbers of employees to move up the value chain and escape monotonous and dangerous tasks. But as far back as 1959, the World Health Organization was noting adverse psychological impacts, not just of automation, but even of the prospect of automation. Research published in 2018 suggests that in the United States, a 10% increase in the likelihood of being affected by automation is associated with decreases in physical and mental health of 0.8 and 0.6% respectively. Technology is also making it easier for employers to monitor workers. Some suggest the level of anticipatory conformity this can encourage amounts to a surrogate form of automation. One of the sectors in which concerns about automation and monitoring have become most prominent is online retailing, where the level of efficiency with which warehouses in particular can now operate has led to numerous reports of productivity targets causing physical and psychological strain among workers. However, workplace monitoring can actually reduce output if workers perceive it as an indication of distrust. Loss of privacy due to monitoring may have a similar effect. A study in a Chinese factory found that workers shielded from monitoring by a curtain were 10 to 15% more productive than those without. Quit fucking watching me. I'll work. Conversely, in a study of U.S. restaurants where monitoring was being used to deter employee theft, large increases in weekly revenues were recorded, the result of unexpected improvements in levels of customer service. Yes, that is the other side of the coin, isn't it? Wider changes in the structure of work and in its place in society are a further source of potential stress. Job security and stability are in decline in many advanced economies, with real earnings growth sluggish or stagnating and less predictable gig economy work expanding. In many low-income countries, meanwhile, secure and stable employment has always been the exception. For example, 70% of employment in sub-Saharan Africa is classified as vulnerable by the International Labour Organization. Evidence from the workplace reinforces concerns about growing problems with mental health. The UK review that found sickness-related absences overall fell by more than 15% between 2009 and 2017. Absences related to mental health problems increased by 5%. Of course, not all mental health problems recorded in the workplace are caused in the workplace. But employers and regulators ought to ensure that workplace conditions are not triggering or exacerbating problems. The UK review recommended revising health and safety provisions to take greater account of mental as well as physical well-being. Now, this is from the World Economic Forum. This is presented in the yearly report at Davos, the world power structure. Why well-being matters. Individual harms matter in themselves, but they can also feed into wider systemic risks and challenges. For example, there are costs. Research by the World Economic Forum and the Harvard School of Public Health suggests the global economic impact of mental disorders in 2010 was $2.5 trillion, with indirect costs, lost productivity, early retirement, and so on, outstripping direct costs, diagnosis and treatment, by a ratio of around 2 to 1. Beyond the economic risks, there are potential political and societal implications. For example, a world of increasingly angry people would be likely to generate volatile electoral results and to increase the risk of social unrest. If empathy were continued to decline, the risk might become even starker, in some societies at any rate. Empathy underwrites all political systems that aspire to the liberal condition, and no amount of law or regulation will overcome a lack of empathy. Internationally, repeated accusations have been made in recent years of rival states using technology to foment angry, fragmentation, and polarization. It is not difficult to imagine such emotional and psychological disruptions having serious diplomatic and perhaps even military consequences. So that's what all the money sees as the risks to people. These are all facts, but they're all together. And like I said, nobody going to tell you if you don't go look for them. Probably nobody will tell you because they suck. Fight or flight, preparing cities for sea level rise. Rapidly growing cities are making more people vulnerable to rising sea levels. 2/3 of the global population is expected to live in cities by 2050. Already an estimated 800 million people in more than 570 coastal cities are vulnerable to a sea level rise of half a meter by 2050. Some cities and countries started decades ago to put strategies in place to deal with accelerating sea level rise. In the last 20 years, approaches have shifted notably towards supplementing hard engineering strategies with greater promotion of more soft nature-based approaches. In many cities, however, preparations are lagging and the need to take action is increasingly urgent. If global warming continues at its current rate, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, considers it likely that the rise in atmospheric temperature will reach 1.5 degrees Celsius within the next 35 years. Forestalling this will require unprecedented action to drive decarbonization of agriculture, energy, industry, and transport. It appears increasingly unlikely that the world will meet even the 2 degrees Celsius upper limit identified by the Paris Agreement. The current trajectory is towards a rise of around 3.2 degrees Celsius. As global temperatures have increased, so sea levels has risen at an accelerating rate. According to the IPCC, the mean sea level rise between 1901 and 2010 was 1.7 millimeters per year. Between 1993 and 2010, it was 3.2 millimeters a year. Global sea levels will continue to rise through the 21st century and beyond, owing to increased oceanic warming and loss of glaciers and ice sheets. According to the IPCC, a 2 degree Celsius increase will cause sea levels to rise between 0.3 meters and 0.93 meters by 2100. Other research suggests this rise could be as much as 2 meters, even with warming below 2 degrees Celsius. Beyond the year 2100, it could eventually reach 6 meters. The uncertainty is due to the complex nature of the interaction of atmospheric warming, oceanic warming, and ice sheet responses. For example, the collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet could push up sea levels globally by 3.3 meters. Bit of ice there. Relative sea level rise will be even higher in the many cities that are sinking because of factors that include groundwater extraction and the growing weight of urban sprawl. Some cities are sinking faster than sea levels are rising. In parts of Jakarta, for example, ground level has sunk by 2.5 meters in the past decade. In addition, sea level rise amplifies the impact of storm surges, as it takes a smaller surge to produce the same extreme water level. Uncertainties surround the precise interactions of regional sea level rise and patterns of urban development. However, it is clear that Asia will be the worst affected region as a result of a combination of hydrology, population density, and asset concentration. Asia is home to 4/5 of the people who are expected to be flooded if there is a 3-degree rise in global temperatures. China alone has more than 78 million people in low elevation cities, a number that increases 3% each year. Deltas are home to more than 2/3 of the world's largest cities and 340 million people. These delta cities are particularly vulnerable to land subsidence. Relative sea level rise poses the highest risks for the Krishna Delta, India, the Ganges Brahmaputra in Bangladesh, and the Brahmani in India. In Bangladesh, a rise of half a meter would result in a loss of about 11% of the country's land, displacing approximately 15 million people. Potential damage. Sea level rise threatens significant damage to property, not only homes and businesses, but also public assets and critical infrastructure. Research suggests that economic impacts are highly concentrated geographically, where sea level vulnerabilities interact with high-value property and infrastructure. Just 4 cities account for 43% of the average annual losses: Guangzhou, Miami, New Orleans, and New York. The researchers note that because coastal flood risks are highly concentrated, flood reduction actions in a few locations could be very cost-effective. Existing protection already reduces these losses significantly. The same research compares cities' recorded average annual losses with their expected exposure to a 100-year flood event. The results vary hugely. For example, Amsterdam's exposure to a 100-year flood event is more than double that of Guangzhou. $83 billion damage to Amsterdam, $38.5 for Guangzhou. But the strength of Amsterdam's protection means its average annual losses to date are just $3 million average per year, compared to $687 million for Guangzhou. In the United States, a study found that between 2005 and 2017, sea level rise wiped $14.1 billion off home values in Connecticut, Florida, Georgia, New Jersey, New York, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia. In developing countries, the threat to property is often exacerbated by coastal erosion, as rising sea levels, sand mining, and built infrastructure disrupt the flow of coastal sediment. Some coastal communities in sub-Saharan Africa are already being washed away, losing up to 30 to 35 meters of land each year. A study by the UK National Oceanographic Centre projects the global cost of rising sea levels at $14 trillion per year in the year 2100. It found that China would face the biggest costs in absolute terms, while as a percentage of GDP, the impacts will be highest for Kuwait, 24% of GDP, Bahrain, 11%, UAE 9%, and Vietnam 7%. Now, various forms of infrastructure and economic activity are at risk from rising sea levels. Roads. A study of coastal roads on the U.S. East Coast estimates that high tide flooding already causes 100 million vehicle hours of delay every year, which could rise to 3.4 billion hours by 2100. Railways. Researchers predict that a 4.5-kilometer stretch of coastal railway in the United Kingdom would be disrupted 84 days each year with a half-meter sea level rise, and the line would cost hundreds of millions of pounds to divert. Ports. The World Bank has identified 24 port cities in the Middle East and 19 in North Africa at particular risk of sea level rise. Rising sea levels will lead to a greater frequency of disruptive events, such as Hurricane Florence, which closed North Carolina's Point Port to trucks for 10 days in September 2018. Internet. In the United States, more than 4,000 miles of underground fiber optic cable and 1,100 nodes are projected to be underwater within 15 years, with New York, Miami, and Seattle at greatest risk. Unlike submarine internet cables, these are not designed to be waterproof. Sanitation. A 2018 study found that in the United States, a sea level rise of just 30 centimeters will expose 60 wastewater treatment plants, which serve more than 4.1 million people. Water treatment facilities in Benin and other countries in West Africa are already threatened by the sea. Drinking water. Pollution of aquifers will be exacerbated by declines in stream flow. By the 2050s, more than 650 million people in 500 cities are projected to face declines in freshwater availability of at least 10%. As rivers and streams contain some groundwater, salination could also affect surface level freshwater. Energy. The C40 Cities Initiative has identified 270 power plants that are vulnerable to a sea level rise of 1/2 meter. These plants provide power to 450 million people, mostly in Asia, Europe, and the East Coast of North America. Tourism. In many cities, coastal areas are a source of revenue from tourism and business. In Egypt, for example, the IPCC has estimated that a 1/2 meter rise in sea levels would destroy Alexandria's beaches, leading to losses of $32.5 billion. Remember how I said climate's in everything? Well, we certainly lay it out in this chapter. There's more to come. Sea level rise can lead to increased salination of soil and of water sources used for irrigation, particularly in delta regions. In Bangladesh, the World Bank estimates salination could cause a 15.6% decline in rice yield. In 2017, 18.8 million people were newly displaced by weather-related causes, including floods and coastal storms. The intensifying impact of sea level rise on coastal cities and plains will render an increasing amount of land uninhabitable or economically unviable. This is likely to lead to population movement within and from large cities. More people will be crammed into shrinking tracts of habitable urban space, and more are likely to move to other cities, either domestically or in other countries. These movements have the potential to cause spillover risks. For example, they could result in heightened strain on food and water supplies and in increased societal, economic, and even security pressures. According to the World Bank, climate change could force 86 million people in sub-Saharan Africa, 40 million in South Asia, and 17 million in Latin America to permanently relocate internally by 2050. Coastal adaptation. cities faced with the risk of damage from rising sea levels can adapt either by trying to keep water out or learning to live with water at higher levels. Some strategies and technologies are new, but the basic idea is not. There are three main strategies. The first involves hard engineering, projects to keep water out of cities, such as seawalls, storm surge barriers, water pumps, and overflow chambers. The second involves nature-based defenses, for example, conserving or restoring mangroves and salt marshes, or seeking to shape how floods will affect cities, rather than always trying to prevent them. The third strategy involves people, for example, moving households and businesses to safer ground, or investing in social capital to make flood risk communities more resilient. An appropriate mix of coastal adaptation measures can potentially reduce some coastal impacts by several orders of magnitude. The Netherlands is at the forefront of coastal adaptation because of its existential exposure to rising sea levels. 2/3 of the country is vulnerable to flooding. The importance of water management is recognized in the country's administrative structures. Regional water boards levy their own taxes for flood protection rather than pretending on government. The Netherlands pursues a mix of the three strategies. Its highly developed hard infrastructure includes an extensive system of dikes and the world's largest storm surge barrier. However, inland floods in the early 1990s, in which 200,000 people were evacuated, led to a shift of approach. Instead of continuing to build even higher dikes, which means greater damage is done if they are breached, the Room for the River program lowered some dikes to allow farmland to be inundated in flood events to protect towns. Farmhouses in affected areas were demolished, and families moved to new homes built on artificially created mounds, 8 meters high. In Rotterdam, where 90% of land is beneath sea level, a program called the Sand Engine involved dredging sediment from the North Sea and depositing it off the city's shore to prevent waves from eroding the coastline. Rotterdam is also home to numerous urban water innovations, such as floating houses and city squares designed to collect millions of liters of water in flood conditions. They go on to talk about other methods of control that are being employed around the world. I gather more as a demonstration to the people at the forum that, hey, you know, if you're one of these places, because I mean, how many of these people came from one of those 48 cities? A lot of them. We'd like you to keep coming and paying your dues. So, you know, keep your city afloat. No time to waste. As sea levels rise and urban vulnerabilities increase, the urgency of the need to respond to these changes is going to intensify. Beyond adaptation measures, addressing urban vulnerability to sea level rise will require households, businesses, and government to avoid exacerbating dangers. There's little point putting new flood defenses in place, for example, if existing defenses are undermined through continued development of homes and businesses in coastal areas and on floodplains. The affordability of flood resilience is set to become an increasingly important issue. Robust risk financing strategies will be required, both to fund investment in adaptation and to pay for recovery when floods occur. At present, spending on recovery is almost 9 times higher than on prevention. Turning that around will not be easy. Building support for preemptive spending and action, particularly if it involves major disruptions such as relocation, can take many years of dialogue and planning. There is no time to waste. As adaptation becomes more costly, questions of burden sharing will arise. For example, between the public and private sectors, and in between municipal and national authorities. Burden sharing may also be needed between countries. Wow. That's just for the coasts. That doesn't talk about any environmental problems for all the inland world or the oceans themselves. And one of the main jobs of this organization is predictions. What ifs? There's a chapter of this report called Future Shocks. 10 pages, 10 possibilities. Things that could happen today. As the world becomes more complex and interconnected, incremental change is giving way to the instability of feedback loops, threshold effects, and cascading disruptions. Sudden and dramatic breakdowns, future shocks, become more likely. In this section, we present 10 such potential future shocks. Some are more speculative than others. Some build on risks that have already begun to crystallize. These are not predictions. They are food for thought and action. What are the possible future shocks that could fundamentally disrupt or destabilize your world? And what can you do to prevent them? Weather wars. The use of weather manipulation tools stokes geopolitical tensions. Weather manipulation tools, such as cloud seeding to induce or suppress rain, are not new, but deploying them at scale is becoming easier and more affordable. As the impacts of climate-related changes in weather patterns intensify, the incentives to turn to technological fixes will increase in affected areas. Think of governments trying to manage simultaneous declines in rainfall and increases in water demand. Aside from the potential environmental consequences, at a time of increasing geopolitical tensions, even well-intentioned weather manipulation might be viewed as hostile. Perceptions would be paramount. A neighboring state might see large-scale cloud seeding as theft of rain or the reason for a drought. Cloud seeding planes might be viewed as dual-use tools for espionage. Hostile uses are prohibited but cannot be ruled out. For example, weather manipulation tools could be used to disrupt a neighbor's agriculture or military planning. And if states decided unilaterally to use more radical geoengineering technologies, it could trigger dramatic climate disruptions. As technologies evolve and deployment increases, increased transparency about who is using what and why would help limit destabilizing ambiguity. So too would active discussion and collaboration on environmental vulnerabilities, both bilaterally between bordering states and on wider regional and global multilateral platforms. The first, what if, climate. Quantum computing renders current cryptography obsolete. When the huge resources being devoted to quantum research to large-scale quantum computing, many of the tools that form the basis of current digital cryptography will be rendered obsolete. Public key algorithms in particular will be effortlessly crackable. Quantum also promises new modes of encryption, but by the time new protections have been put in place, many secrets may already have been lost to prying criminals, states, and competitors. A collapse of cryptography would take with it much of the scaffolding of digital life. These technologies are at the root of online authentication, trust, and even personal identity. They keep secrets from sensitive personal information to confidential corporate and state data, and they keep fundamental services running, from email communication to banking and commerce. If all this breaks down, the disruption and the cost could be massive. As the prospect of quantum code-breaking looms closer, a transition to new alternatives, such as lattice-based and hash-based cryptography, will gather pace. Some may even revert to low-tech solutions, taking sensitive information offline and relying on in-person exchanges. But historical data will be vulnerable too, regardless of any stronger precautions subsequently put in place. Widening gulf between urban and rural areas reaches a tipping point. The world's political geography is being transformed by surging migration from rural to urban areas, straining the web of connections between the two. Divergences are widening on numerous dimensions, such as values, age, education, power, and prosperity. What if a tipping point is reached at which the urban-rural divide becomes so sharp that the unity of states begins to erode? Domestically, divergent values between urban and rural areas are already fueling polarization and electoral volatility in many countries. Greater bitterness and rivalry could lead to localized nativism and even violent clashes. Separatist movements might break through in wealthy city regions that resent diverting revenues to poorer rural areas with which they feel diminishing affinity. Leading cities might look to bypass national structures and play an international role directly. Economically, accelerating urban migration could lead to rural depopulation and the decline of local economies, with potential food security implications in some countries. Better long-term planning for both expanding cities and rural areas at risk of decline might help to mitigate these dangers. Stronger transport and communication links could help soften the urban-rural divide. Resources will be needed, which might require more fiscal creativity, such as finding ways to decentralize revenue-raising powers or more widely redistribute the productivity gains that urbanization generates. Sounds strangely something like that crazy shit socialism. I don't know. Against the grain, food supply disruption emerges as a tool for geoeconomic tensions intensify. With climate change placing a growing strain on the global food system, and with international tensions already heightened, the risk of geopolitically motivated food supply disruptions increases. Worsening trade wars might spill over into high-stakes threats to disrupt food or agricultural supplies. Conflict affecting supply chain choke points could lead to disruption of domestic and cross-border flows of food. At the extreme, state or non-state actors could target the crops of an adversary state, for example with a clandestine biological attack. In these circumstances, retaliatory dynamics could swiftly take hold. Domestically, rationing might be needed. Hoarding and theft could undermine the social order. Widespread famine risk in recent years suggests that greater hunger and more deaths, in least developed countries at any rate, might not trigger a major international reaction. Yeah, it's called Yemen. If similar suffering were inflicted on more powerful countries, the responses would be swift and severe. Bingo. They say it. They know it. More resilient trade and humanitarian networks would help to limit the impact of food supply disruption. But if trade wars were a contributing factor, then countries might seek greater self-sufficiency in agriculture. Agricultural diversification and the development of more resilient crop variants could bolster national security by reducing countries' vulnerability. Nice push for GMO. Digital panopticon. Advanced and persuasive biometric surveillance allows new forms of social control. The biometrics are already making exponential advances. Technologies that were recently in the realm of science fiction now shape the reality of billions of people's lives. Facial recognition, gait analysis, digital assistance, effective computing, microchipping, digital lip reading, fingerprint sensors. As these and other technologies proliferate, we move into a world in which everything about us is captured, stored, and subjected to AI algorithms. This makes possible increasingly individualized public and private services, but also new forms of conformity and micro-targeted persuasion. If humans are increasingly replaced by machines in crucial decision loops, the result may lead not only to greater efficiency, but also to greater societal rigidity. Global politics will be affected. Authoritarianism is easier in a world of total visibility and traceability, while democracy may turn out to be more difficult. Many societies are already struggling to balance threats to privacy, trust, and autonomy against promises of increased security, efficiency, and novelty. Geopolitically, the future may hinge in part on how societies with different values treat new reservoirs of data. Strong systems of accountability for governments and companies using these technologies could help to mitigate the risks to individuals from biometric surveillance. This will be possible in some domestic contexts, but developing wider global norms with any traction will be a struggle. What does that say in reality? The SCLs, the Cambridge Analyticas, the Facebooks, they already got the inside track. The only way they're going to be stopped is with law, and that ain't happening. Not at this point. GDPR, decent step forward, stuff like that, but anything globally, despite a global Bill of Rights, despite a lot of steps that have been taken, implementation, don't hold your breath. Tapped out. Major cities struggle to cope in the face of the ever-present risk of water running out. A range of compounding factors risk pushing more megacities toward a water day zero that sees the taps run dry. These include population growth, migration, industrialization, climate change, drought, groundwater depletion, weak infrastructure, and poor urban planning. Short-term and polarized politics at both municipal and national levels in many countries further heighten these dangers. The societal shock of running out of water could lead in sharply differing directions depending on the context. It could exacerbate divisions. Conflict might erupt over access to whatever water was still available, or wealthier residents might start to import private supplies. But a water shock could also galvanize communities in the face of a shared existential challenge. Either way, damage would be done. Hygiene would suffer, increasing strains on the healthcare system, and governments blamed for the failure might be tempted to scapegoat weaker communities, such as those in informal dwellings with unofficial connections to the water system. Getting governance and planning right during times of plentiful water would reduce the risk of day zero arising, including public information campaigns and basic maintenance of existing infrastructure, as well as regulations limiting the amount of water that households, businesses, and governments can use. New water sources could be identified subject to careful risk assessments, and smart technologies could be deployed to reduce water use and improve water reclamation. Why the hell don't they just get serious about desalination? Since the sea level keeps going up, contested space. Low-orbit Earth becomes a venue for geopolitical conflict, with satellites now central to the smooth functioning of civil and military technologies. The amount of commercial and government activity in space has been increasing. This is a legally ambiguous realm, creating the potential for confusion, accident, and even willful disruption. Space debris is proliferating too. 500,000 pieces are now moving at the speed of a bullet in low orbit. Even accidental debris collisions could cause significant disruption to internet connectivity and all that relies on it. But at a time of intensifying geopolitical competition, space could also become an arena for active conflict. Even defensive moves to protect critical space assets might trigger a destabilizing arms race. Precision weapons and military early warning systems rely on high-orbit satellites. Militarizing space might be seen as necessary to deter a crippling attack on them. In the future, as space becomes more affordably accessible, new threats of space-based terrorism could emerge. New rules or updated protocols would provide greater clarity, particularly on the rapid expansion of commercial activity, but also on military activity. Even simple measures could help, such as ensuring transparency on debris removal activities to prevent the misinterpretation of intentions. At a time of fraying global cooperation, space might be an area where multilateral advances could be signed up to by us all. No rights left. In a world of diverging values, human rights are openly breached without consequence. Amid a new phase of strong state politics, it becomes easier for governments to sacrifice individual protections for collective stability. This already happens widely. Lip service is paid to human rights that are breached at home or abroad when it suits states' interests. What if even lip service goes by the wayside and human rights are dismissed as anachronisms that weaken the state at a time of growing threats? In authoritarian countries with weak human rights records, the impact of such a tipping point might be one of degree. More rights breached in some democratic countries. Qualitative change would be more likely. A jolt towards an illiberalism in which power holders determine whose rights get protected, and in which individuals on the losing side of elections risk censorship, detention, or violence as enemies of the people. Battles are already underway among major powers at the UN over the future of the human rights system. In a multipolar world of divergent fundamental values, building far-reaching consensus in this area may be close to impossible. Universal rights are likely to be interpreted locally, and those interpretations then fought over globally. This is the information that is given to all those filthy rich, filthy connected people. They know everything that we know, that we live. They know. So guess what? They don't give a shit. That was my whole point. Forget about who says what and who takes a picture with who. None of that means shit. That's just paying the mortgage. This is the stuff that they actually talk about and look at and work between each other. They know how bad things are. We'll see what gets done. See what I mean? You ain't going to hear this stuff on TV. No mileage in that. But that's the thing about Davos that gets me. These aren't just a bunch of anointed people that like to get together and blow a lot of coin and have a good time. There are a lot of people there that know exactly what's going on. They just don't fucking care. That's it for this week. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week on The View Up Here. Good night.